You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96 with Melinda Francis, Norman Richmond. Joining us on the line is Dr. Gerald Horne, who is the Moore's, John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of African American Studies, or History and African American Studies at the University of Houston, and has written many books. His latest book is The Counter-Revolution of 1836 Texas Slavery and Jim Crow. And like Mr. Horne, how is that the Texas book doing? How?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Second of all, the title of the book includes the subtitle, The Roots of U.S. Fascism. And I think that
very important.
Those last few words help to explain why the book has gotten a fair amount of play, because understandably and justifiably, there's a lot of concern about the rise of fascism, although I'm not sure if people really understand how the roots of fascism inhere in a settler colonial state based upon mass enslavement and genocide, such as this so-called republic that exists south of the Canadian border. But having said that, I would also say that the proliferation of podcasts and programs like this, entire networks like the Activist News Network, I think that on the one hand, cumulatively and collectively, they're serving to erode the influence of the bourgeois media and the bourgeois press, such as there's only so much time in the day, and there's a battle for ears and eyeballs. And with the proliferation of podcasts and vodcasts and all of this other alternative media, MSNBC and CNN are seeing their audiences erode. And in fact, Disney, which controls ABC and ESPN, is in deep crisis. CNN is so desperate that they've even floated the idea of having Charles Barkley, the rotund quipster who is a basketball announcer, take over primetime. That's been floated. And I think that bespeaks the crisis. And I would like to think that programs like this and your comrades in the internet trenches are serving a useful purpose, not only in undermining the bourgeois press, but also putting forward a political line that ultimately will spell ill for the rise of fascism.
You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96 with Dr. Gerald Horne. I guess the first question I want to ask you is, what is the political significance of the Super Bowl? I know Michael Parenti has written quite a bit about this whole sports and politics, and this Super Bowl is kind of a joke when you think about football is only played in the United States, Canada, maybe Germany, England to a degree. And I guess the most popular sport is the real football, where they don't play with the pigskin. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it speaks to the former point that I made. I think that sports is one of the few entities that continues to track eyeballs and ears from a mass audience. In fact, this Super Bowl today, February 12th, will probably be the most watched event on television this year. And that helps to explain why a 30-second commercial spot goes for $7 million, which has grown exponentially in recent years. That is to say, the rate one charges for that 30-second spot. Interestingly, last year, all the rage was crypto. It was like the crypto bowl to a certain degree. But now that's no longer the case. It'll be an explosion of alcohol commercials. today at the Super Bowl. At one time, Anheuser-Busch had a sort of monopoly over alcohol commercials. That's no longer the case for this Super Bowl. And finally, I should mention the fact that about 70% of the players on the field happen to be of African ancestry, although that's not duplicated with regard to the coaching staff. Although in recent months, there has been an expansion of Black executives in the front office, interestingly enough. And that, since we're talking about sports, let me ask you a question. Bobby Hull, a star hockey player with roots in Canada, just expired. And I noticed in his obituary that he was a supporter of the ultra-right. Do you have any details to add about that?
Yeah,
go ahead, Melinda.
Yeah, no, I actually looked it up. There's been a couple of articles just like around and pointing to the fact that, you know, he was a Nazi sympathizer, and that, you know, that kind of taints, you know, his you know, accolades because it was basically the big, but that's all I have, the information I have. A couple of things that people are questioning, you know, should we, you know, celebrate a person who was, you know, a Nazi sympathizer kind of thing. So that's the only details I have, but yeah, there has been people pointing towards that kind of thing.
There's a guy by the name of Don Cherry who I don't even know if Don Cherry is still alive. The real Don Cherry is from Los Angeles, is from Watts. Went to John C. Fremont. That's Don Cherry, the musician. But there's another Don Cherry who was a commentator, and I think he played hockey. He might have coached, but he was a genuine, certified, amen, hallelujah, thank you, Jesus, redneck. And he was actually ran off of the air maybe five years ago. When did Don Cherry get of radio and television? He used to do Hockey Night in Canada, and he was a bizarre character because he was flaming with his racism, and it finally caught up with him. I shouldn't say the Times caught up with him because, you know, Go ahead, Melinda.
He was ousted 2019, so just before, you know, the pandemic. Yeah, he was. Yeah, I think it was like it caught up with him because, you know, he's been spewing. I couldn't even watch Hockey Night in Canada after a while, when I used to watch, you know, more hockey. But yeah, he was. I can't recall exactly what he said, but it was kind of interesting because he had, you know, continuously ranted the same rant for years, and in 2019 he was, you know, he was told to hit the door kind of thing. So I don't know if you remember what he actually said when he was finally.
I can't remember, but I remember. All I do remember is that they quoted Percy Mayfield, "Hit the road, Jack." You know, they had it. "Don't you come back no more, no more, no more, no more." They told him hit the road. He was really disgraced because you know, the black press, of course, jumped on him, and what's left of the left jumped on him as well. But he was yeah. Bobby Hull was. I do remember Don Cherry, and a lot of the commentators. Bobby Hull was regarded as a giant in hockey. I think he was good on the court, but off the court he was very problematic. I know that Gordie Howe, I think it was Gordie Howe, played hockey skated with Marvin Gaye a couple of times. I remember I read that in one of Marvin Gaye's books. You know, Marvin Gaye tried to play basketball, football. He had I think Marvin tried out for the. It was a joke, but I guess he tried out for the Detroit Lions. Do you remember that, Gerald?
Yeah. Also, he sponsored a boxer in the current issue of Rolling Stone. There was a piece about that. How you got into boxing on the managerial side.
I got yes. The boxer was had a couple of fights, and I think he got the fight. So whoever he fought, Sugar Ray Leonard or somebody, got waxed, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
You want to continue?
Yeah, no, I think we're we're really behind on the topics. I don't know where you want to start, Gerald, but why don't we start with Brazil and Argentina?
Well, this happened a few weeks ago. This association of Latin American and Caribbean nations, and Brazil and Argentina are accentuating this trend, which is extremely important, of trying to move away from the dollar in terms of the trade between those two countries. I mean, it's rather ironic and bespeaks the potency of U.S. imperialism to this point that countries like Brazil and Argentina, when they trade, they don't use their own currencies, they use the US dollar, which is obviously a boost to Washington. Now they're moving away from that, and that's part of this trend of de-dollarization, a new term added to the vocabulary, an important term. You see it with regard to discussion of the Saudis, who helped to accelerate this trend, moving away from the dollar in terms of their most precious commodity. Speaking of petroleum, that emerged from the trip to Saudi of Xi Jinping. Obviously, Russia has been forced to move away from the dollar because of sanctions. And so there are a lot of frightening headlines, frightening from the point of view of U.S. imperialism, I should say, rather quickly, that suggests that the ultimate impact, ironically, of this Ukraine misadventure will be to accelerate the decline of U.S. imperialism. You see that in the hysteria reflected in a U.S. general calling for war with China in the next 18 months, believe it or not. You see it in the Ballon-acy, by the Ballon-atics. I noticed that your own Justin Trudeau collaborated with him. Mr. Biden is shooting down some sort of balloon that supposedly came from China. And it's interesting, on this side of the Pacific, it's taken quite seriously. In China, they're making jokes about it. I'm not sure what to make of that, quite frankly. But interestingly enough, the bottom line, as they say here, is that the United States is using these multi-million-dollar fighter jets and missiles to shoot down a bunch of hot air. And it seems to me that sort of trade-off is not sustainable in the long run. In any case, that's the state of play.
You're listening to Diasporic music on Black Power 96. And can you talk about Mr. Lula's visit to Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, Mr. Lula da Silva, the leader of Brazil, was just in Washington. He met with the U.S. president. He met with Senator Bernie Sanders. He met with Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez. He met with the leadership of the labor movement. I would like to think that that's a positive sign, although since the labor movement in this country tends to be one of the most hawkish supporters in terms of foreign policy of U.S. imperialism, you never know. But let's hope that that's a positive sign. Hopefully, the wing of the ruling class that Mr. Biden represents knows that the alternative to Lula is Bolsonaro, the Trump of the tropics, who's been chilling in Florida ever since he lost the election late last year, and apparently had a hand in the attempted insurrection of January 8th, 2023, and may be faced to return home to face the music. We shall see. Perhaps that's why he's in Florida. We're expecting great things from Lula. And let me also say in this context, for those who follow Freedom Now, KPFK, 11 a.m. Pacific on Saturday, we're going to have some very interesting interviews about Brazil coming up in the next few weeks. So stay tuned. Actually, starting next week, we're interviewing the leading specialist on African people in Latin America. Speaking of George Reed Andrews in his book, Afro-Latin America. And I think that your audience should get quite a bit from this. I mean, for example, he talks about the Declaration of Independence of Uruguay in 1825, which, unlike the Declaration of Independence in 1776, which even some of our friends on the left tend to celebrate, the Uruguayans came out four square against slavery in 1825, just like Simon Bolivar, the national hero of Venezuela, after being lobbied by revolutionary Haiti, also did the same at a time when the so-called revolutionary republic, speaking of the United States, which, as I said, these people on the left, even though the country is hurtling towards fascism, they still cling to this fantasy about the United States being a revolutionary country. I mean, trying to tell people on the left that that's not true is like trying to tell a 3-year-old that there's no such thing as Santa Claus. They don't want to believe it. I mean, it's part of their identity. So tune in next Saturday, 11 a.m. Pacific.
Well, I was listening to Judge Joe Brown, and he mentioned Washington, D.C. You're doing research on Washington, D.C., and he said that, I guess, in the 20s, I don't know, it was the 20s or the 40s, they had a battle in Washington, D.C., where he was praising he was talking about the whole Black history thing and the fact that the ruling class or the people that oppress us always, when they try to deal with our history, they project us as some, step and fetch it and happy-go-lucky Negroes. He was basically saying that, I don't know if it was World War II or World War I, he was basically saying that the veterans came and really put on a show in terms of fighting the white supremacists and basically defeated them. Does your research concur with that?
Well, first of all, my book on Washington will be out in a few months. Revolting Capital is the title, in every meaning of those two words. The bonus marchers, the bonus army as it was called, they came to Washington early 1930s. It was multiracial. It wasn't just Black veterans. Point number one. Actually, there are probably more Euro-American veterans than any other category. They were seeking veterans benefits. Veterans in any country tend to be volatile. Look at Southern Africa, for example, where they're a powerful lobby in both Zimbabwe and South Africa. And what happens is that two men who go on to make their mark in fighting wars, speaking of the future U.S. President Dwight David Eisenhower, who's then a military man, and General Douglas MacArthur, who wanted to start World War III in Korea by dropping an atomic bomb before he was sacked by President Truman. Well, he was also involved in routing these veterans in the early 1930s in the revolting capital known as Washington, D.C.
And who is publishing? Is that a monthly review book?
International publishers. Revolting Capital.
International publishers.
Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000.
What do you think about the whole question of D.C. in terms of their bid to become somewhat of an independent enclave, if I can say that?
Well, good luck. I mean, here's a spoiler alert. Washington, D.C. is led by a House of Representatives that's dominated by the right. And you have a very strong right-wing movement in the United States of America. and Washington, D.C. is still majority black, and the right wing does not see it in their interest to have a 51st state known as Washington or Douglas or whatever, that would then produce 2 black U.S. senators, or certainly progressive senators. So I wish them luck, but I'm a man who somehow is wedded to political reality.
So it's still going to it's going to remain Chocolate City only in those George Clinton and those who like his music.
Well, in terms of statehood, for the foreseeable future, that's off the table. Maybe it'll come when the political calculations and the political correlation of forces change. We were just talking about a fascism a moment or two ago. So, I mean, I know people in the United States, especially our Euro-American friends, they always like to hear good news. As I say, they prefer, since we're talking about the Super Bowl, they prefer cheerleaders, not coaches. They just they don't want to deal with the fact that Trump got 75 million votes, that he won a majority of the Euro-American vote. Those are ugly realities that they prefer not to deal with. It's like the fictional French intellectual who says, well, I know what you're saying is true in practice. The question is it true in theory? In other words, they have this theory of the case. The United States is a revolutionary republic, but somehow it tends to make these right-wing maneuvers. And as Mr. Obama used to say, that's not who we are. And that's mirrored by our friends on the left, too, I'm afraid.
Did you talk about this Pompeo memoir? And why do you read so many memoirs?
Well, it's primary sources. Even though Charles Barkley said that he was misquoted in his memoir, even supposedly he wrote it, but presumably that's a primary source, it's straight from the horse's mouth. And anyway, Michael Pompeo, the former Secretary of State under Trump, former CIA director under Trump, he has a memoir, and he says that Mr. Trump wanted to invade Mexico and he had to talk him out of it. And that is the companion of Tucker Carlson, which we talked about recently, talking about why is the United States involved in Ukraine when it should be overthrowing Justin Trudeau's regime in Canada. I think this should be taken very seriously, because I think that as the United States encounters failure in Ukraine, they'll be looking for softer targets. And quite frankly, I can't think of a softer target than the Great White North, not to mention Ottawa.
But in terms of a memoir, if I was writing a memoir, my personal memoir, I could put in there that I could outrun Usain Bolt, I could knock out Lennox Lewis, I could outsing Eddie Kendricks, and get away with it because it's my memoir. But it would all be BS.
Well, that's true. I mean, it's just like anything else. You know, journalists, when they interview people, they try to find 2 or 3 sources to corroborate, and you would look for corroborating sources for anything that you quote, quite frankly. Mm-hmm. And in any case, as the lawyers might say, if you're quoting a memoir, you're not only quoting it for the truth of the matter asserted, you're also quoting it insofar as it reflects state of mind of the person who sang it. For example, this reference to Pompeo and Trump, it could be introduced as an aspect of the state of mind of at least Mr. Pompeo, that he finds it necessary to suggest that his supervisor, Mr. Trump, wanted to invade Mexico, even if you don't accept that Mr. Pompeo might have misheard or misinterpreted Mr. Trump's words.
Well, let me say that in terms of that question of I was getting ready to ask you a question about Wikipedia, but I guess you answered it already. You have to cross-reference all of that because like a memoir, anybody can say anything on Wikipedia, but it's up to the researcher to cross-reference and do all of the research. Am I correct in saying that?
Well, it's not only that, but once again, as the lawyers, I mean, that's the thing about law. I mean, law is an engine. One of the things you try to do in court is ascertain what's accurate and what's true. And as a result, a number of rules have been generated over the centuries that are quite useful in that regard. Not flawless, not perfect, but useful. For example, many journalists in particular, and even historians, they like to rely on interviews. For example, I'm doing a book on Los Angeles in the 1960s and 1970s. People keep asking me, well, when are you going to talk to this person? When are you going to talk to that person? Well, that's all good. You know, I'm not against interviews, but in law, there's something known as the best evidence rule. The best evidence of what happened in 1968 is not what somebody is telling me in 2023, saying that he was involved in the Brinks robbery and tried to blow up the banks of America. And you know, the best evidence is what's on the record from 1968. Now, if he did an interview or was in court in 1968, raising his right hand and swearing under pain of perjury that he tried to blow up the Bank of America, well, that's evidence that you would tend to accept more willingly than what somebody says in 2023 when they just want to be in a history book and want to blow up their reputation, just like you were saying, well, you know, I sing better than David Ruffin and I outrun Usain Bolt. Well, let's look at your times in 1968 and let's hear your voice in 1968.
The questions, Melinda?
Yes. Do you want to talk about Philippines, the new bases?
Well, it's part of the tightening noose around China. The United States is renewing its bases in the Philippines. Interestingly enough, the bases emerged about 120 years ago when the United States was waging war against the Philippines. And then the target was China. Now the target, then the target was Japan. Now the target is China. And in fact, interestingly enough, the recently installed president of the Philippines is in Japan as we speak, because Japan is the key frontline state with regard to confronting China right now, which obviously is the turnabout from World War II, but that shows you how things change.
When we talk about the Philippines, don't you think the Philippines have been shortchanged in terms of the Philippines have a real serious history of resistance, but it seems to have been people don't realize how strong were the Hulks, and first of all, who were the Hulks, and how strong were they in the Philippines?
Well, the Huks, for short, HUKS, was a guerrilla movement that fought the Japanese occupation during the war. But then, of course, after the war ended, U.S. imperialism turned on them with a vengeance and helped to crush them. The leader of the Huks, Louis Taruc, T-A-R-U-C, wrote a memoir that you can still find, where Paul Robeson wrote the foreword to. One of the great victories for anti-communism and counterinsurgency post-1945 was the victory over the Huks. And of course, William Pomeroy, who, as his name suggests, was not Filipino, although he was married to a Filipino woman. He fought alongside the Huks and was detained for a while. Eventually, he becomes a leading left-wing journalist in London, writes an interesting book on apartheid, but no longer is with us, no longer in the land of the living.
I heard about the Huks. Is it Huks? Yeah, the Huks in when I was living in Detroit, Pompeo, General Baker, that was one of the books he always suggested that, well, not one of the books, but anything that he wrote, we were executive mandated to read all of his works.
Well, Pomeroy wrote a book about them, about his experience, and that said, Louis Taruc, T-A-R-U-C. As you know, I'm doing a book now on Southeast Asia. And I've only finished about maybe 3% of the labor. And interestingly enough, after I put that out there, this brother from Thailand, from Bangkok, wrote me saying he wants to help me by sending me information on the Black experience in Thailand. He's been sending me all this material lately.
Well, there's a lot of, well, I guess the whole question of, there's been a relationship between African people worldwide in Thailand. I guess a lot of African people have gone to Thailand for at various times, wouldn't you say?
Well, I would say it's been seafarers, missionaries, military men, in particular military men during World War II, because in neighboring Burma, now Myanmar, there was a huge complement of Black American military men, including the late James Jackson, who, as you know, went on to become a leader of the U.S. Communist Party. But in any event, I'm sure Docuvixen would like to press on.
Yes. Let's get to the Biden State of the Union.
Well, one of the most remarkable aspects of this address was, on the one hand, Mr. Biden quoting the usual propaganda, which is that this is such a great country, it's a country founded on an idea of equal rights and justice, blah, blah, blah. And then, in a remarkable episode, he talks about how Black parents have to instruct their youth, particularly male youth, as to how to avoid getting shot if you're stopped by the police. And he goes into some detail about that, saying, turn the light on in the car, don't reach for your driver's license, keep your hands on the steering wheel. I think he says, speak in an evenly modulated voice, because you don't want them to get too excited. You want to sort of lull them into a kind of lethargy. It's really something. So if you're a Black parent who didn't know all this, now you know to cite Biggie, because Mr. Biden told you.
I think we have run out of time.
I think maybe we could just, touch base a little bit about the Pan-African Film Festival, and then we can leave the rest till next time.
Well, yeah, I'm out here in Los Angeles now for the Pan-African Film Festival. Last night I saw this documentary on Huey P. Newton. It was very useful. It was about his trial in 1968 for supposedly killing a police officer. They were able to interview the only Black person in the jury who maneuvered to become the foreman of the jury. And he talked about how he was able to direct the jury away from giving Huey the death penalty. It was quite remarkable in that sense. And it'll be lasting to February 20th, and then all of the films, you can see them online. As a matter of fact, there's a film about Fremont High School that I missed, Fremont High School in Los Angeles, that I understand was very good, but you can watch it online at paff.org post February 20th.
Yeah, we just talked about that film. That's Harold Wilton. He supports this show. We've had him on the show, but that's Harold's film.
Correct.
The Liberation of Fremont High. Yeah, the Liberation of Fremont High. That was that's the film.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess we'll. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'll cut you off.
No. Go right ahead.
No, so I guess you've already said you have to sign off because you got another interview to do. Correct?
Yeah, generally speaking, yes.
All right. So until next time, thank you, sir.
Good luck.
Is there anything else you'd like to add, Melinda?
No, I just want to encourage listeners to keep on supporting, become a member of the station. Go to blackpower96.org/donate. Become a member today. Support the station, support the show.
And thanks to Elise Watson for technical brilliance as usual. And I guess until next time, take care.